بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والسيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين لا سيما مولانا وسيدي صاحب العصر والزمان روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء وعجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف ولعنة دائمة على أعدائه من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. For the love of our 12th Imam and the hastening of his return, one salawat upon Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. We continue, brothers and sisters, in this commemorative session for the month of Muharram as we remember the tragedy of Karbala, as we remember the supreme sacrifice of Abu Abdullah Hussein alayhi salam and all that him and his family and companions went through, for no other reason than as he himself had told to his half-brother when he left Medina that he was going forth for the reformation of the nation of Islam. He recognized, and as we also recognize if we study the history after the death of Rasulullah, that in the short span of 50 years, the Prophet dies in the year 10 after the Hijrah, 10 or 11 around in that time, and in the year 61, so 50 years after the death of Rasulullah, the nation of Islam had become so deviated, so corrupt, so inept, so willing to let corrupt leaders like Yazid and those who came before him take over the rule of this nation, that they would be ready to shed the blood of the grandson of Rasulullah. And not only shed the blood of the grandson of Rasulullah, but to do it in the most heinous of ways, to ensure that every single person that was with him in that caravan would face their wrath because of the fact that all he wanted was for reformation of the nation of Islam. And so as we remember this tragedy, we make a pledge to ourselves, hopefully every night, that we will stay on the path of the Prophet of Islam, that we will do our best to follow in the legacy of Abu Abdullah and to be ready to give everything that we have in the preservation of this religion for the sake of the Prophet and all that he struggled for in his mission to remove humanity from the shackles of slavery and bondage and to give humanity the freedom under the banner of the servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we've been going over these last 6 nights that have already passed by, we've looked at many different topics, as you'll recall, all geared towards the betterment of ourselves. If you'll recall, right from the very first night, we were looking at the topic of SBNR, spiritual but not religious, and we looked at how this society that we live in today, the secular, very consumer-based society, is perhaps responsible for pushing people away from God, from religion, from organized worship, and drawing people towards a religion of the self. Between there and last night, we mentioned many topics. The one thing that I want to highlight from last night was when we talked about this pursuit of happiness or to gain contentment in life, that how we contrasted that with that spiritual but not religious movement about people who engage in many different ways to try to find happiness in life. And ultimately we concluded, hopefully you agreed, but if you didn't agree, that's your prerogative. But we tried to come to a conclusion that as believers, as human beings, that we need to look for happiness, we need to look for spirituality, we need to look for contentment in life with what we have, not with what we don't have. If you look at your bank account, there's a lot that you don't have. If you look at your personal life and what you have accumulated, there's a lot of things we don't have. But rather than looking at what we don't have, or what Allah has not given us, as we said, we need to focus on what Allah has given us, be thankful for that, be content, submit to Allah for what He has given us, and to move forward with that understanding that we can do better if we try, but if we don't move ahead, we are still happy with what Allah has determined for us. Off of that, I want to piggyback off of what we said last night into the topic for tonight, which is about the power and the psychology of supplication, of dua. Right? What we talked about last night is also related and intertwined to our discussion tonight. Because at the same time that we look for more in life, we always realize that a lot of times that more comes from asking from Allah. Actually, not most of the times, every time, whenever we want anything in life, whether it's physical, whether it's material, whether it's spiritual, it all comes back to coming from Allah. Right? Ultimately, whatever you and I have comes from Allah. The very life that we have, this existence, it came from, obviously, from our parents, but there was a first cause that brought all of this into being, and Allah put that into motion. So the life that we have comes from Allah. Our smarts, our intellect, our looks, everything we have comes ultimately from Allah. And that is where we want to look at tonight, that how can we is it possible, first of all, or how can we change, or how can we attract the power to get more from Allah, or change our destiny? Right? This is one of the things that people have been talking about for probably millennia. Right? Because we think that we are born and that we are only given what we get, and that there's no way to change our predicament or our situation. But as believers, we recognize that there are hidden forces in this world. Just as we have the powers of the physical world, how we have science, and we have physics, and we have all of these things that are around us, we also have to recognize that there are unseen powers that have the ability to change the way that things in our destiny and what will occur to us. Let me begin with a very famous verse of the Quran, which is found in chapter number 2, which is Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 186. And there are, multiple times in the Quran where Allah speaks about dua, about supplicating to Him. And also we know that there are many ahadith, but this verse, this somewhat lengthy verse, gives us a good indication of the concept of dua. And in the verse, Allah is addressing obviously Rasulullah, because as we know, when you study the life of the Prophet and you study the verses of the Quran, we begin to realize that the ayat of the Quran were being revealed to the Prophet both in the Meccan and then in the Medina era, based upon the needs and requirements of the community. So things would happen, and the verses would come down. Or people would ask the Prophet questions, and the Prophet would anticipate wahi, revelation, and he would give the answer that Allah gave to him. This is really how the Quran came down to the Prophet and how we have it. It's through constant interaction with the Prophet, through communication, through events happening, and Allah would reveal to the Prophet things to say to the community. So a time happens where a companion or a man comes to Rasulullah, and he says to the Prophet that, is Allah so far away, is Allah so distant from us, that I need to scream and shout for Allah to hear me, right? Sometimes you see this, you go to the Middle East, you go to the Muslim countries, and you see people in the masjid, and they're literally screaming their head off, right? Their hands are raised up into the skies. They're literally yelling to Allah. So this man is asking a similar question, that do I have to yell to Allah? Do I have to go to the highest mountain in Medina or Mecca? And in our case, do I have to go to the Canadian Rockies at the top of a mountain on the gondola and make dua to Allah? He's so far away, so if I get to the top of the mountain in Banff, then God can hear me more than if I'm in the foothills of Calgary? This is the question the man asked. Then he said, or is Allah so close to me that I can just whisper to Him? I can just quietly talk to God, right? What is the balance? Is God so far away I need to go on a mountain and yell and scream and shout and wave my hands to get God's attention? Or do I just quietly speak to God in a normal tone, in a whisper, and God can hear me? So as I mentioned, that the Prophet, he had the right to speak, obviously, but he would wait for revelation to come to him. And revelation came to Rasulullah in this verse where Allah says, وَإِذَا سَلَكَ عِبَادِي anni fa inni qareeb. That when my servants ask you about me, I am near. Now this verse is very interesting. If you look at it, it says, وَإِذَا سَلَكَ ibadi anni. It doesn't say kul lahum or kul. So Allah didn't say that when my servant asks you about me, say to them, say. Right? So many times in the Quran you see kul huwa Allahu ahad. Right? Kul ya ayyuhal kafirun. Kul. Every time Allah would, or not every time, sorry, but many times when Allah would address the Prophet and tell him to say something to the people, he would say kul and then say to them. And then that would be recorded in the Quran. But when it came to the proximity of Allah, right, how close Allah is to us, Allah removed that word qul, meaning that don't even have to say it. I'm so close to them, O Prophet, that they just have to recognize that level of proximity I'm at. So Allah says, وَإِذَا سَلَكَ عِبَادِ عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيب. When my servants ask you about me, indeed I am near. Don't even say to them, say, just I am near. That's all you have to say to them. أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ دَاءِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. That I answer the call of the person who calls upon me when they call upon me. Right? So Allah is making a promise that if somebody, a believer particularly, if they call upon Allah, Allah is giving us a promise, a pledge in the Quran, right? We talked about this on the third night, the promises of Allah in the Quran. When we read these ayat, we have to recognize that Allah is making a promise. He doesn't go against His word, right? And inna Allaha la yukhliful mi'ad, as the verse mentioned that we quoted on the third night. Allah would never renege on His promises. He is truthful to His word. So when He says that ujibu, when I answer the call of the supplicant, of the one making dua when they call upon me, it means for sure, definite, that Allah will answer the call. But with many things in life, it is a two-way street, right? You have to give in order to receive. Life is a give and take relationship. In family life, it's a give and take relationship. At work, it's a give and take. You work, you get paid. At school, you study hard, you do your homework, you'll get good grades, right? You can't get one without the other. So Allah didn't just end it and say, Ujibu da'wata da'i idha da'an. He didn't end it there. He continued and He told the Prophet to say to the people, فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَأَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. So if you want that answer from God, if you want God to answer the du'as, the Prophet was given the recipe, the formula for success, which is what Allah says is let the people who are making dua also answer my dua, my call, my invitation. Allah is making an invitation to us, and Allah says, in order for me to answer your call, you also need to reciprocate and answer my call. And not only answer my call, He says, وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي. And you need to believe in me. وَلِيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَأَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. You need to believe in me. Right? We need to believe that Allah is listening, that He's all hearing, that He will not go back on His word. And then He says, when you believe in God, when you have that level of conviction, then Allah says that through that they will perhaps be guided. They will be on that path towards servitude, towards having their supplications accepted. Now, one of the beauties as we have within Islam, and more particularly as followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, when it comes to du'as, we have this beautiful collection of supplications, this massive plethora of du'as that I would say probably none in the rest of the Muslim world have at their disposal. They have access to it if they want to come and knock at the door of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. They will get the du'as such as dua kumail, as dua as-sabah, dua al-iftatah, and the list goes on and on. But if you just do a very cursory glance at what we have, it really would amaze you. You look at it at a yearly basis. Once a year we have the day of Arafah, 9th of Dhul Hijjah, correct? Just last month we celebrated the day of Dhul Hijjah and the day of Eid. And on the day of Dhul Hijjah, the 9th of Dhul Hijjah rather, the day of Arafah, the most powerful impacting day of the Muslim calendar, we have not one, but we have two different du'as of Arafah. We have the du'a of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam in the Sahifa, and we have the second du'a, which is the du'a of Sayyidul Shuhada alayhi salam. Two powerhouses of du'as, right, that we have for the same event, du'a al-Arafah, for the day of Arafah. That day which is, again, the hadith tell us, if you can make it through the day of Arafah, especially if you're in the land of Mecca, and you complete all of the manasik, and you make your way from the Hajj to all the stages, you end up leaving Hajj as if the day that you were born from your mother. Every sin is wiped off of your record. That's the power of the day of Arafat. And the supplications only add to the magnanimity, only add to the beauty and the greatness of the day of Arafat. That's once a year that dua comes, right? So it's in a book tucked away in a shelf at home, and once a year we'll open that book and we'll read that dua, but we'll benefit from it. But then you begin to trickle down, right? Every month we have du'as. The month of Muharram, we have a dua to read at the beginning of the month. Next month, the month of Safar we'll have a dua to read. Rabiul Awwal, Rabiul Thani, all the way through. Every month, the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt gave us different du'as to read, what to look forward to in the month. Right? Every month of the Islamic calendar, it brings with it new blessings from Allah, new levels of mercy, new levels of spirituality, new levels of connection to Allah. And one of the ways to magnify and elevate ourselves with that connection is to find the du'as of that particular month. Begin each new month with the du'a for that month. Read the translation if you don't understand the Arabic of it. And then realize what it is that we are seeking to get in that month. And so yearly, monthly, every weekly we gather, right? Or hopefully we gather every week, every Thursday night for the dua of Kumail. A dua which Amir al-Mu'mineen taught to Kumail 1400 years ago. And he told him, look, read this every Thursday night. Read it on the 15th of Sha'ban. Read it at least once in your lifetime if you can't do it more than that. And that becomes a weekly dose of spiritual connectivity to God. A way to reconnect to Allah through the words of the Commander of the Faithful, where there is nothing but Allah in that dua. Right? One of the accusations that some of the Salafis and Wahhabis and these kinds of people with that distorted mindset, they say that your du'as, you pray to the imams. Right? They have this accusation against us. You're grave worshippers, you pray to the imams, and other foolishness they accuse us of. We'll show them du'a kumail and say, look through the entire du'a. Is there in the name of any imam in there? It's completely about Allah. Right from Allahumma inni as'aluka bi rahmatika allati wasiyat kulla shay all the way to the end. It's all Allah, 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 Allah. There's nothing about any human being other than the salawat at the end where we have to praise the Prophet and remember the Ahlul Bayt. It's all about God. Right? So we have yearly, we have monthly, we have weekly, we have daily du'as. The Imams have taught us every day of the week there's a special du'a to recite. Saturday, for example, is the day of Rasulullah. There's a special du'a and ziyarat. Sunday is Lady Zahra and Amir al-Mu'mineen. Monday, the other Imams. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Till you get to Friday, which is the day of the 12th Imam. Special ziyarat of the Imam on Friday. A special dua for Friday to recite. So now we have at a daily basis, we have different du'as to recite. And then one more level is we have books that have du'as for every hour of the day. 24 hours in the day. We have different adhkar to recite at 1 o'clock, at 2 o'clock, at 3 o'clock, all the way down till midnight, and then starts that cycle again. Obviously, we probably can't read those because we're probably asleep for many of them, or at least half of them. But the fact is that the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, alayhim as-salam, have thought about our need for spiritual connectivity to Allah to the extent where they give us prayers and supplications for every instance of our lives. Everything that we would truly need, I would say, for this life and for the world to come is encapsulated in one or many of these du'as. Now, it's not going to be possible for us to discuss all of them tonight, so my goal in the time that I want to continue in is just to give us a very brief overview of the du'as, somehow the philosophy or the mechanics of how du'as work, And then hopefully we can go and do our own homework to see how dua can resonate with me. How can I use du'as to make myself a better individual and hopefully connect to that never-ending source of rahmah, which is Allah, to actually get what I want from Him. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. One of the first things that I want to mention in this portion is that we need to realize that du'as are very complex. Right? It's not easy, or it's not possible, I would say, for me to sit up here and say that make a dua and it will be accepted. Right? Because it's not that easy. Right? Even though Allah said, "Ud'uni astajib lakum," that call upon me and I will answer you, there are a lot of factors that go into play with a dua. One of the things that we have to recognize is that du'as can either be beneficial or harmful. Du'as are not always, we can say, having a positive result or outcome in our lives. Now what do I mean by this? Give you a very practical example of our life, right? The life that we all live. In this physical material world, most of the food that we eat is fit for human consumption, right? Unless you have a major health issue, you can pretty much eat anything and you can remain healthy for the most part. But something like sugar, let's say, or anything like rice or grains, if you eat, let's say, a sandwich today or a bowl of rice, there's no problem, right? But if you're a type 2 diabetes patient, you know that white flour, white rice, white pasta, this is like poison because it will give you a spike in your blood sugar. And you could, if you continuously engage in that sort of destructive diet, you can go blind. You can have your legs amputated because of losing the nerves in your feet. And obviously, eventually, you could have massive health issues. So sugar is a benefit, no doubt. Bread is good to eat. Pasta and rice are things that people, live on. In many of our cultures, rice is a staple food in many of our diets. But it could be detrimental and harmful and even dangerous for some people. Grapefruit is a good fruit to eat, right? There's benefits in it. But doctors will say that if you're on certain medication, blood thinners, or if you're on certain other medication, grapefruit has the ability to either over-amplify medication or severely curtail it. So you'll see if you get some medication, it'll say if you're taking this medication, don't eat grapefruit or drink grapefruit juice, because it has the potential to take that medication and magnify the dosage by 5 or 10 times. So it might be good for the average person, but sometimes that food or that product can kill somebody else. Du'as, we can look at it in a similar way, right? Many times people ask for things in life. And for some people, that dua might be valid and it might be beneficial for them. But somebody else might make the exact same dua, thinking that it's good for them, and it could lead to their destruction in this world and obviously in the world to come. Right? Somebody might make a dua that they want to become extremely rich. Very simplistic example, but somebody may want a dua from Allah to be answered, to be extremely rich, thinking that that's where their happiness lies. Right? There was that story at the time of Rasulullah. This companion comes to the Prophet, asks the Prophet, make dua that I become financially independent, I become successful. And the Prophet knew that this man didn't have the capacity to bear that level of wealth. So he would kind of, put off this man. And eventually got to a point where he needed a loan. He kept, asking the Prophet, and the Prophet made dua, and the Prophet gave him some money to start his business. Although the Prophet knew that this was not going to be good for this individual, for him particularly, because of his own spiritual state of being. But he got the money, he started his little small business, he began to grow, he bought some livestock, he kept growing. He developed such a large number of livestock, he had to leave Medina and move outside of the city. So there was a time when he was at every Jamaat prayer, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, he never missed the Salat. He was there praying with the Prophet, in the rows, in the congregation. As the business began to grow and expand, and he began to have to move out of Medina, he began to come less and less. Maybe he'd come on Jummah. He'd come maybe once a week for the Salatul Jama'at. It came to a point where now he didn't have time, right? Because money and the business had completely engulfed his entire life. It was a dua he made. He wanted it. He thought that is where happiness lied for him. And so the Prophet said, take it and let's see where you can go with it. It came to a point where he is then approached by the tax collectors. The Prophet had tax collectors. We have zakat, we have khums, and he had the animals. He had to give the zakat for that. And so when the man comes and says, the Prophet wants the zakat, you're a Muslim, your wealth has expanded to so much, you now need to give. He became very upset. He says, what do you mean I have to give? This is my money. I've developed all of this business. What do you mean I have to give now to the Prophet? And what ends up happening, according to the story, is the Prophet says, I gave you that 1 or 2 coins, whatever it was, I want it back. So he gave it back to the Prophet, and they say from that point forward, his entire empire crumbled. He lost everything. He was back to where he was, square one. Just a poor man in Medina with whatever basic life he had. Right? But we see that how that wealth, which somebody like al-Mu'mineen Khadija alayha salam, she could use the millions of, let's say, dirhams or millions of dollars that she had the ability to be in control of her wealth rather than the wealth controlling her. But this man couldn't. So when we say be careful of the du'as, we have to recognize that maybe there are times where we are not ready to take on that responsibility of what we're asking for. Right? We have to be careful. That doesn't mean we don't ask the dua, but it just means we need to really think a lot of things through before we make dua to Allah. Because we might just get what we want, but what we want might not be what we can handle, and it might actually destroy us rather than allowing us to live the life that we envision that we would have if we had what we wanted. At the same time, we realize, brothers and sisters, that du'as also, although Allah said, call upon me, I will answer you, but we also have to recognize that there are times where we become our own barrier for du'as not being accepted by Allah. As the verse says, "Ud'uni astajib lakum," right? Call upon me and I will answer you. Or وَإِذَا أَسْأَلَكَ عِبَادِي أَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ دَاعِي إِذَا دَعَانِ. Both of these verses we understand that Allah answers and accepts the supplication of the supplicant. But we have a concept which is mentioned in the dua of Kumail, where we sometimes become the barriers of our du'as, making it to Allah. Again, a very simple example in our lives here today. You might be on the best wireless carrier in Canada. You might be paying for your 5G connectivity. But if you come inside this building, maybe there's too much interference, you won't connect at a 5G speed. Or you might go to the mountains and you're going from Banff to Jasper and you'll get zero connection in the mountains. Why? You'll say, well, I'm paying $100 a month for a 5G signal. Why am I not getting it? But do you realize that the environment that you're in is preventing you from having that cell phone connectivity at maximum speed? Sometimes we develop that barrier around us, brothers and sisters. We might be praying, we might be fasting, we might be doing everything, but sometimes we are surrounded by sin. And intentionally we're surrounding ourselves with sin. And sometimes being surrounded by sin, we become affected by the sin. And being affected by the sin, we begin to sin. And when we begin to sin, we then recognize that those doors to the du'as being accepted become blockaded. Not because Allah can't hear the du'a, but because we have put that. Again, like the example of the cell phone coverage, exact same. So we see in Dua Kumail where Amir al-Mu'mineen says, and we say that every Thursday, Allahumma ghfir li adh-dhunuba allati tahbisu ad-du'a. Oh Allah, forgive me those sins that act as a barrier, as a force field around my du'as. So I'm making dua to Allah. Ya Allah, I want this, I want that, I want a spouse, I want children, I want to do good, I want money, I want better health, I want whatever we want. But when we begin to go into an environment and living a life of sin, Allah has the right to say that, look, I've told you that when you sin, you are putting a covering over your du'as. It's not that the dua that Allah cannot answer the dua. It's that we are covering it over intentionally. And when we cover over it intentionally and our du'as are not accepted, then we have nobody to blame but ourselves. Now, I don't want people to leave thinking that every time a dua is not accepted, it's our fault, it's my fault, I've sinned, I'm a bad person, I'm evil. No, don't think that. But do reflect on this point that if you know you're leading a life of goodness, you know you're not sinning or you're trying your best not to sin, and if you make a mistake, you turn to Allah, you do tawbah, you ask Allah for forgiveness, and you're doing your best to lead a good life, and you still find that your du'as are not always accepted or not readily accepted, then recognize that you could be going through a time when Allah wants to test you. He wants, because life is a test, as we've been mentioning in many of the talks, and because life is an exam, we have to sometimes bear the time constraints of waiting for the response. At the same time, also realize that if Allah were to answer every dua of every person at the same time, there would be literally pandemonium and anarchy in the world. Right? It would be crazy out there if everybody's dua was accepted. Imagine if you are making a dua, you're coming to the center, you're running late, you get to the intersection and your light turns red. And you were to make a dua, Ya Allah, I need that light to turn green because I'm running late to get to the center. Okay, so let's just say Allah changes it to green for you instantaneously. People coming from the other way who had a green light, theirs turns red, and they also make a dua. Ya Allah, I'm getting late, turn the light green. Now imagine all four lights at the intersection turn green. What's going to happen? There's going to be massive accidents. Right? Now imagine everybody in the world is making that dua. One young man is saying, Ya Allah, I want to marry that girl. Allah accepts it. But then there's two other guys who also want to marry that girl. Who's going to get their dua accepted? Right? You can't all have the same dua accepted. Right? There has to be an order, a system in place. Some du'as have to be accepted. Some supplications have to be rejected. Some du'as have to be delayed. Some du'as will never be answered, ever in this world. And Allah has a solution to that because He said that He will answer the du'a, right? But He didn't say when He would answer the du'a. That's also the inner reflection we have to have on that verse when He says, "Ud'uni astajib lakum," or in the other verse I quoted, وَإِذَا سَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. He says, "Ujibu da'wata da'i idha da'an." But He didn't say, I answer the call of the supplicant immediately in this world, in their lifetime, next week, next month, in 5 years. He kept it open-ended. Right? It might take you 10 years for a dua to materialize. It may take 25 years. Right? There's many people we know, husband and wife, they got married for 12 years, 15 years, they're trying to conceive. They couldn't conceive a child. They're making du'as, they're going for ziyarah. They're doing everything that the books of hadith tell them to do in the books of supplication. Literally 17 years after marriage, they have their first child. Right? Why? Couldn't Allah deliver a child within, the first 9 months of marriage, the first year, first 2 years of marriage? No, Allah could. But there were other reasons why that delay had to be there. What are they? We don't know. They don't know. That's in the wisdom of Allah. But we have to recognize and submit that Allah did that or does whatever He wants in His world based on His wisdom, and what His wisdom dictates happens to us. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. when the Amir al-Mu'mineen had this dua kumail, and he said this, Allahumma ghfir li adh-dhunuba allati tahbisu ad-du'a, he didn't explain in the dua. If you'll notice that line, Allahumma ghfir, comes out about 4 or 5 times. But Imam Ali never, alayhi salam, he never mentioned what are those sins. He just says, Allahumma ghfir li adh-dhunuba allati tahbisu ad-du'a. But what are those sins that would prevent a dua from being accepted should be a question that we ask. And Amir al-Mu'mineen never told us the answer, unfortunately. But fortunately for us, another Ali told us the answer, that is Ali ibn Hussein Zainul Abidin alayhim as-salam. The 4th Imam would come on the scene and he would actually give commentary of those lines of the Dua Kumail. What are the sins that tear apart the veils? What are the sins that prevent du'as? What are the sins that taqta'ur raja wa tunzilul bala? He would come and explain each of those. When it came to the sins that prevent our du'as from being accepted, or having that veil or curtain placed over them, he mentioned a few different things. I'm just going to talk about the one very briefly within a hadith, which is where he said that when people have what they call su'udhan, having a bad thought of Allah, entertaining negative thoughts about Allah. Why did Allah do this to me? Why didn't Allah fulfill my du'as? Why didn't Allah do this? Why didn't Allah do that? The Imam told us that when you think bad about Allah, then whatever happens, you will perceive it as being bad. Right? So let me explain this through a hadith of our 8th Imam, Imam Ar-Radha alayhi salam. Salu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Where the Imam is quoted as saying, أحسن الظن بالله فإن الله عز وجل يقول أنا عند ظن عبدي المؤمن بي إن خيرا فخيرا وإن شرا فشرا. He says, have good thoughts and estimations about Allah. Think good about Allah. Because Allah has said, I am as my believing servant considers me to be. Therefore, if my servant thinks good of me, then they will find whatever happens to them to be good. And if my servant thinks bad about me and whatever happens to them to be bad, then they will perceive me as being bad. Meaning that the Imam is not saying that if I think bad about Allah, that He will do bad to me. And if I think good about Allah, then He will be good to me. Because some have this opinion, 20 some odd years ago, there was a book that came out called The Secret. I don't know if people have read about it or heard about it. It was one of the biggest fads in the early 2000s, which was basically positive thinking. Think positive and the world will completely change and everything will align with what you want. And there were books, there were videos, movies made about this concept, and I knew people who were religiously following this concept. If you think good, then good will happen. That whole karma. Think good and good will happen. Think bad and bad will happen. So the Imam is not saying that if you think good, then God will do good. And if you think bad, then God will do bad to you. He's saying that when you think good about Allah, when you have this husna dhan of Allah, then whatever happens to you, you will recognize that there is good in it for you. Even if you lose your job, you have an accident, you lose a family member, you have an injury, whatever happens, when you think good about Allah, you'll realize that whatever happened is for a reason, that God has done this to me for a particular reason, and I'm going to submit to it. And on the flip side, whenever something quote-unquote bad happens, I will say that if it happened, it's because there is good for me in whatever happened to me. Not because God is evil and bad and He wants bad for me, but because sometimes we need a wake-up call. We need to be, we need to have a good shaking to recognize where we're at with God, with Allah. So the Imam says, when you think good about Allah, then whatever happens, you'll accept it, the good or the bad. You won't question the wisdom or the authority of Allah. And du'as are one of those examples where we call upon Allah. We make the du'as to Allah. Sometimes we may find them to be accepted. Other times we may find that either there is a short-term delay, or maybe it may take 10, 15, 20 years for that dua to materialize. If we have the husn al-dhan of Allah, we think good about God, then it's all good. Right? We're not worried about it. We're not thinking, well, why doesn't God respond to me? I'll look at my own personal life and see what am I maybe doing wrong. If I find I'm doing everything correct, then I'm going to say, well, okay, you know what? Then there's a greater wisdom at play. And Allah doesn't want me to have whatever I'm asking for, not out of spite or anger or any other reason other than the fact that it is not my time yet to have what I am asking for. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So I'm going to end with one last point about how the du'as function. And it's that we also need to recognize at one level that du'as are not only or not necessarily there to cause a metaphysical change in the world. Now, what I mean by that is that we sometimes perceive that when I make a dua, that the entire world should shift, or the various circumstances of the world should shift to give me what I want. Right? Rather than realizing that maybe we need to look at du'as in another way. And what I mean by another way is that we need to look at du'as as being a transformative, that the du'as have the transformative nature to change my outlook on the world and what I'm doing. Now, there's no doubt that there's certain du'as that we might make that no matter how hard we try, we're not able as individuals to change our state. Right? There may be many du'as like that, right? Where we cannot make that change and we rely solely on Allah. Right? At the time of the Battle of Badr, for example, the Muslims are outnumbered 3-1. 313 Muslims, over 1,000 non-Muslims. In that situation, there is nothing that the Muslims or the Rasul could have done to change the odds in their favor. They just did not have enough Muslims and military power on the battlefield. They could not do anything. It's not like they could just call up a number and have another 600 troops shipped out and they could, have even odds. No, they had nothing they could do. But when they make the dua, Allah changed through a metaphysical change in the universe. As the verse of the Quran mentions, that Allah sends angels from the skies, from the heavens, to be there for the believers. So Allah had to, through that dua, make a metaphysical shift in the world to give the believers the upper hand. Because you couldn't just find 700 people and bring them to a battlefield. So that is one way the du'as work. But the other ways, what I want to touch upon, is that the du'as are also giving you and I the power to learn how to change, okay? Giving us the ability to reanalyze our situation and how we need to change ourselves. We talked about this briefly one night in the verse where Allah says that, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ, where God will not change the condition of a people until they change that which is in themselves. So if you look at dua number 30 of the Sahifat al-Sajjadiyah of the fourth Imam, supplication number 30 is about people who have a debt, who have a dain, who have a mortgage, bank loan. I'm sure many of us in this room, we're paying our mortgages on our homes, we have a bank loans, we have lines of credit, we're in debt on our credit cards and so on and so forth. And we make dua to Allah, Ya Allah, increase my rizq, and give me more money, give me more sustenance to pay my bills. Now, two ways we could look at that. Either, Allah could begin to make automatic monthly deposits into your bank account with money, but that's not going to happen, right? You're never going to find your bank account increasing by making dua to Allah. Allah will not do an e-transfer to your account. It just won't happen. But you look at the words of the dua. So the Imam begins by saying, Allah, I seek refuge in you, my Lord, from the worry and the thought about my debt, right? And I seek protection in you, O my Lord, from the distraction and the sleeplessness of debt. When you have a mortgage, you buy a house for $1 million house here in Calgary, and you're carrying, let's say, a $500,000 mortgage. You have sleepless nights because you're trying to figure out, how am I going to pay my bills? The interest rate is 7.5%. My mortgage is shooting up. How am I going to pay it? Right? And so you're going to have sleepless nights. You're going to be worrying, how am I going to pay my bills? You know you're on a fixed income from your job. You can't work overtime. You're not getting more money. How will you pay it? Again, Allah will not deposit money in your account to pay the bills. But then the next part of the dua gives us the antidote, the solution. How do I put myself or keep myself to be able to pay all my bills? And what the Imam says is very profound and deep, right? You have to go home and read the dua number 30 from the Sahifa to see the words of the Imam. But he says, at the first line, he says, prevent me from extravagance and excess. وَحْجُبْنِي عَنِ السَّرْفِ وَالْإِزْدِيَادِ. Allah, allow me not to be so wasteful with my money and extravagant. Allow me to control how much I spend. Allow me to buy a house that I can afford. Allow me to spend the amount of money that I know I can manage the bills to pay every month. And then he goes on to say, وَقَوِّمْنِي بِالْبَذْلِ وَالْإِقْتِصَادِ. Put me on a course of generous spending and moderation. Right? Allow me to know how to be moderate in my spending. Not to go and spend my entire paycheck. Not to put everything on the credit card because I know the bill will come at the end of the month and I'll figure out how to do things at the end of the month. Or I know my parents will give me this much allowance, I'll just spend it all. No, the Imam says, teach me, Allah, and give me the ability, the strength to have moderation in my spending. And he says at the end, hold me back through your gentleness from squandering my wealth, from being one who wastes my money away. So the Imam is not saying, Allah, give me money, give me money, give me money. Answer my du'as through giving me more. He's saying, answer my dua by teaching me how to be responsible. And this is where I say that the power of dua is not a metaphysical transformation of the world. It's a physical, spiritual change in ourselves, where we believe in ourselves, where we rely on ourselves, but through the connection that we have to Allah. When we connect to Allah, again, that terrestrial to celestial connection, and we recognize that we turn to Allah for Him to guide us and support us, then we can recognize that the dua can change our lives. But if we're just wanting from Allah without changing our own situation, then we're not going to be able to actually realize the benefits of the du'as. We're going to be making the du'a every week, every day, every hour, every month, every year, on Arafat and on Thursdays and on this day and on that day. We won't get an answer. We'll get more and more upset with Allah. We'll be very vengeful, vindictive against Allah. We might even curse Allah. We'll have bad thoughts of Allah. We'll have su'u dhan with Allah. And we'll actually dig ourselves further and further deeper into despondency and stress. And we will never have that peace of mind that dua is meant to give to us. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. And in the interest of time, I'm going to conclude and just remind ourselves of why we are here in these nights of Muharram. Again, there's much more about du'as, but I'll end it there. And remind ourselves that the entire event of Karbala, the entire narrative of that tragedy that happened on the day of Ashura, that everybody went through the challenges on their own will. They went through difficulties. I'm sure they made du'as to Allah. Maybe those men that were there and the women who were there in Karbala made dua to Allah to die as a shaheed, to give their lives in the way of Islam. Right? And what better way that had they made those duas? Because they could have died in any way, but if you were to make a dua, Ya Allah, allow me to lose my life on the path of Islam. Right? It's one thing to die in bed. But then it's one thing, as we say in the ziyarat, that Allahumma jal mahyaya mahya Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa mamati mamata Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Right? Death is a reality for all of us, but what better dua to make that, Ya Allah, I'm going to die. Allow me to die on the path of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Allow me to die defending the cause of Islam. Allow me to die in a death which is dignified, which is one that will elevate me in the world to come. That even if I don't die as a real shaheed in this world, that give me the rank of a martyr. And that's a dua that we should make every day and night, brothers and sisters, especially when we make the ziyarat of Abu Abdullah. And as I conclude, I just turn my attention to one man who was one of those shaheed who gave his life on the plains of Karbala. As we've been going over these last days and nights, we've been touching on various personalities. And tonight I just want to remember Abu al-Fadl Abbas alayhi salam. A man who needs no introduction really, other than Abu Abdullah, who is obviously Sayyid al-Shuhada. I'm sure whenever we think of Karbala, we always remember Abu al-Fadl Abbas. Because here is a man who was obviously much younger compared to Abu Abdullah. He was obviously from the same family. They shared fathers. But yet the relationship, although there was two brothers, but you know when you see Abu al-Fadl Abbas in the books of history, he looked at Abu Abdullah not as just a brother, as an older brother. That was his Sayyid, his master, his leader, his Imam in every sense of the word. Right? There was never a time when you look at history that Abu al-Fadl Abbas alayhi salam would ever call his brother, Ya akhi, oh my brother. Although he had a right to, from the biological standpoint, there were brothers. But the love he had for Abu Abdullah, the respect he had for Abu Abdullah meant that he always referred to him as my Sayyid, my leader, my master. And it was on that night of Ashura, and on the day of Ashura, where Abu al-Fadl Abbas really exemplified that love he had for Abu Abdullah. I'll just leave us with this one point, brothers and sisters, that Abu al-Fadl Abbas, on that day of Ashura, as he saw the companions go one after the other, as the family members were going, he had that state of agitation. He was uneasy. He wanted to go, and he would tell his master, his brother, his leader, he says that, give me the permission to go and bring an end to these munafiqeen. And every time Abu Abdullah would say, no, you are my flag bearer, you have to stay. Once you're gone, if you lose your life and that flag falls, the troops will be demoralized. So Abu al-Fadl Abbas waited and waited and waited. He had the sabr, he had the patience. And eventually when everybody was gone, when there was now nobody left, and he hears al-atash, al-atash, that the children in the tent are crying of hunger, they're crying of the thirst of the day of Ashura. He then goes to his master and he says, Ya Sayyidi, he says, now give me that ability, give me that permission to go. And Abu Abdullah says to Abu al-Fadl Abbas, he says, look, he says, if you really need to go, I want you to go and get water for the children. They're crying that the thirst is killing them. You go and try and get water and bring it back for the children. And that's exactly what Abu al-Fadl Abbas alayhi salam would do on the day of Ashura. That is, he mounts his horse, and as he walks his way into that battlefield, and as the enemy soldiers are looking at him, as we realize, as the books of Maqtal mention, that a point comes on Abu al-Fadl Abbas, he's able to actually break through the enemy ranks. He's able to make his way to the tributary of the Farat. And as he jumps off of his horse and he puts his hands into the water, as the books of Maqtal mention, that he takes his two hands and fills them with water. And as he begins to lift that water to his mouth, he recites those words of poetry where he says that, oh my nafs, speaking to himself, he says that how can you drink water while your master Hussein is in the tent thirsty? How can you drink the water while the children are suffering from the thirst? He says that this is not the way of my religion. This is not the way of Rasulullah. And so he throws the water back and he takes the flask and he fills up that bag with water and he puts that bag of water behind his back and mounts his horse. And as he prepares to go back home towards the tent to give the children water, as we told in the books of Maqtal, as he begins to go through, the enemies begin to surround him. They realize that even this small amount of water, although it's very little, but it will strengthen the morale of the family. It'll strengthen the morale of Abu Abdullah. And so as he's going forward, as he moves forward, that there's one enemy behind one of the palm trees. And that enemy comes out with a sword and slices off the right arm of Abu al-Fadl Abbas. As the right arm of Abu al-Fadl Abbas falls, he says those words of poetry. He says that even if my arm is cut off, this will never stop me from helping Abu Abdullah. This will never stop me from helping my master. And as Abu al-Fadl Abbas goes forward with his sword now in his left hand, as he moves forward, an enemy comes from behind another palm tree and slices off his left arm. Abu al-Fadl Abbas now has no right arm. He has no left arm. His sword is on the ground. The bag of water is still around his neck. The enemies see Abu al-Fadl Abbas in this way. They begin to shoot arrows at the body of Abu al-Fadl Abbas. The historians say that an arrow pierces the forehead of Abu al-Fadl Abbas. Arrows began to pierce his chest. An arrow is lodged in his eye. But then eventually one arrow pierces that bag of water. The water that he was so preserving and protecting for the children, it begins to fall onto the ground. And this is where Abu al-Fadl Abbas realizes that this is it, that the mission that he had so tried to go to bring water to the children, that even this is now mission, it will not be accomplished. And as he's on his horse in this state, when the enemy comes and pushes him off his horse, he actually has a pillar from the tent, a massive wooden pole, and he smashes the head of Abu al-Fadl Abbas. And in that state, Abu al-Fadl Abbas falls off of the horse. But keep in mind, brothers and sisters, and I'll end with this one last point, that if you've ever fallen down off of the ground, if you've ever fallen off of your bike, if you've ever fallen off of your bed, you'll know that when you fall, you have two arms to break your fall. But remember that Abu al-Fadl Abbas, his right arm had been severed, his left arm had been severed. He had an arrow in his eye, an arrow in his forehead, arrows in his chest. And so when he falls off of his horse, he doesn't have the hands to break his fall. He falls in those arrows that are in his body. He falls and that arrow that is in his eye lodges deeper into his skull. Those arrows in his chest, they penetrate deeper into his chest. The arrow in his forehead, it digs deeper into the cranium, into the brain of Abu al-Fadl Abbas, until he lets that final salam out to Abu Abdullah. And he says, "Oh, my dear brother, adrikna akhak, come to the aid of your brother." But when Abu al-Fadl Abbas sees his master, Abu Abdullah, it's too late. Abu Abdullah can't do anything for Abu al-Fadl Abbas. And he leaves Abu al-Fadl Abbas in that state of losing his life, without his arms, without the water reaching the children on the day of Ashura. He leaves Abu al-Fadl Abbas in his blood on the plains of Karbala. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ.